Good afternoon. Welcome to DER. Probably in the morning, you heard DER probably at least 500 times already. So here's another time you hear about DER. So what we're trying to cover in this session or roundtable is really talk about DER, the promise of DER, the growth of DER, and what is the effect on customer and the grid. So I have a very distinguished panel here. Mike from NYISO, Karl from Austin Energy, and Carlos from National Grid, myself, Meir from Utilligent. I'll let each one of them to introduce themselves. I'm probably going to do a poor job introducing themselves. Talk about themselves and talk about what their company doing, special stuff that their company doing in around DER. Each one will take about 5 to 7 minutes. Then we'll have a couple topics of discussion, and then at the end we'll have time for audience questions. So, Mike?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me here in Austin. The weather is much nicer than New York right now. So as though it's humid, I'm enjoying the humidity. Look forward to the summer in New York. But my name is Mike DeSocio. I work at the New York ISO. I'm a senior manager of market design. My responsibilities include designing capacity markets, financial transmission right markets, energy markets, and recently added a new group on distributed resource integration. So in February of this year, we released a roadmap. That roadmap lays out really the next 3 to 5 years of work for the NYISO on integrating DERs into the wholesale market. So New York is responsible for running the wholesale market in New York State. It's a single state ISO. We started in 1999, and when we did that, we did a big bang approach, introduced 5-minute settlement, 5-minute dispatch, co-optimized ancillary services all at the same time. So our hair was on fire for a little bit. But in the more recent times, it's been interesting to see where policy is taking us and where technology is moving us. And so looking at that future, really we started to focus more on how can we accommodate that and how can we enable it. So the roadmap really lays out four prongs of that approach. The first is really the core of it, which is developing a participation model for DERs. We don't have one today, and what we typically do is try to shoehorn a DER into a demand response program, which doesn't always work well for distributed resources. The second prong is we need to learn. As much as we are experts in this field, we don't know enough about what you all know that DERs can do, how you want to operate DER. What's the most value for your DER? So we need to learn from you. And so we're looking at introducing for the first time ever in New York a pilot program where resources could participate in the wholesale market and we can learn from them. The third prong is we need to get to more granular values. And so that is really looking at granular pricing. Today we do have nodal prices for all resources, but we don't actually expose any of the load side nodal prices. And so we're going to start to do that, which will help DERs understand where they should focus their efforts. And then the last piece is really focused on making sure we're getting the value out of the DERs that we should, which is really focused on metering. What is a balanced meter data policy that will both allow these resources to participate fully, but also let the ISO see what they're doing and not be onerous. So it's a pretty interesting time, very excited to be part of it. The dynamic is tremendous in New York. If you ever worked in New York, you'll understand what I'm talking about, and I look forward to more discussion on that.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this DER working session and discussion. I know my heart's in the right place with fellow energy nerds when you have a standing room only DER panel. Yes. Quite frankly, I was expected to show up and maybe do an 8-person round table. So I really didn't prepare. I prepared more for 8 of us just chatting. than a bigger audience, but I'll tell you what I know. So I'm Karl Popham with Austin Energy. I'm the manager of electric vehicles and emerging technologies. Did anyone come to the electric drive event yesterday? Anyone see that? Okay. So I have two hats. That's my electric vehicle hat, which I'm very passionate about, and I'm also very passionate about the emerging tech hat. And so I'm going to talk to you more about the emerging technology side of my team's effort. So specifically, a lot of the focus in the DER space is something called Austin Shines. If you want to read all about it and get all kinds of materials on Austin Shines, I can encourage you to go to austinenergy.com/go/shines, and you can really dig down and get as deep as you want to in it, but I'll give you a brief overview what that is. So a little over a year ago, we were awarded a $4.3 million U.S. Department of Energy Sunshot Award. Hopefully that doesn't get taken away because we are being identified as a sanctuary city. But the purpose of the award, and we also got an award from the state of Texas, an innovation grant, and also the city is chipping in. So it's a state, local, and federal funding mechanism getting together to basically do this. Is we have in our community, we have a lot of solar and distributed solar that exists today. Our current generation from wind and solar is right around 30% with a goal of 55% by 2025. So that's a pretty aggressive goal. We have about 4,000 PV rooftop solar installations in Austin. So we have this great asset and great, this DER, both commercial and residential. What Shines looks to do is looking at a strategy to tie it with storage. So for Shines, it's going to be mostly lithium-ion battery technology. When I say storage, I'll be a little more specific. To tie in and aggregate at the residential level, at a commercial level, and at a grid level, tie all that together into DERMS, a DER management system, with real-time market signals and other factors to get the most value possible and to achieve higher penetrations within Austin, and hopefully, especially from a DOE perspective and our perspective as well, ability to make it replicatable throughout the US and potentially the world, and what that model looks like. I don't call it a technical pilot at all. There's a lot of technical components and some very new technologies being deployed to include the DERMS platform itself. I consider it a phase 1 rollout because we have big storage goals, and we have very big goals, and a lot of our community demands that of the utility, and so we're reflective of that. We're reflective of those community demands, and we're part of that community as well. So all in, we're talking roughly around 3.5 megawatts of solar, 3.5-4 megawatts of storage. It combines our new community solar projects, which is about 2 megawatts local solar, batteries to support, so that grid scale. It includes commercial scale, multiple business models, so direct utility controlled, as well as a third-party aggregator model. We realize the utility doesn't have to be all things to all people, and what's the space for private enterprise working in the space. And then at the residential, there's a commercial aggregator, direct utility control, and then kind of a set up and forget or fire and forget type mechanism. So happy to talk to you, ad nauseum about our Shines project. We have several folks who are working at it. We have Khalil in the back, who's one of our executive sponsors. He can really, dig down in it as well. I'm representing a pretty large team effort, but so that's what's kind of going on at Austin Energy.
Good. So good afternoon, everyone. It's always tough to follow the local ones, so I'll try to do my best, coming from the Northeast. So my name is Karl. Nouel. I work for National Grid. We're a transmission and distribution utility in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York, both gas and electric. As you probably heard from Richard, a lot going on in New York, about the same kind of activity in Massachusetts. And even Rhode Island, that's a small state. It's a small state with big ideas and big aspirations. They have a lot going on. And I lead a pretty unique team within National Grid. If you think about kind of what we've heard so far, it's funny how a lot of the speakers have talked about kind of how hard it is to innovate within utilities and how hard it is to actually drive change. That's essentially what my team does. So it's a small team of about 60 people, but we're really kind of change agents within the utility. And the way I like to think about the work we do, it's not just around technologies. So technology is something that we use, but it's a lot around business models. And that usually is kind of some of the tougher questions that we get as we get, whether it's electric vehicles, distributed generation, anything that you kind of talk about in the industry, the biggest question is always around business models. That's a lot of what my team works on. And we go from all the way things like company-owned solar, storage, things like the DSP, the Distributed System Platform, which I'm sure some of you have read, one of the projects in New York as part of REV, that is really looking to optimize and integrate distributed resources into the grid. But also all the way to how do we engage customers in those topics, which is equally important. So whether it's residential customers with marketplaces for solar or giving them access, but even on large commercial customers on how do we help them with things like microgrid. Those customers are really sophisticated, that are really looking to advance their energy goals, make themselves more resilient. How do we actually work with those teams? That's what my team does within National Grid, and we work with a lot of people within the company. But it's really good to have a team that's really dedicated to think about that. It gives us kind of the freedom to try a lot of different things. Some way having a different license of doing different things. And I'm passionate about this topic because I think, as you probably heard throughout the day, and even yesterday, a lot of discussions around DER and what's the future, what would it look like. The reality is it's really hard to tell what the future would look like, and if any of us knew what the future is, we probably wouldn't be in any of this room. We'd probably be investing whatever that is. But the reality is I think we'd like to see kind of starting to place a bunch of bets in a bunch of different places, whether it's directly as National Grid, whether it's through some of the funds that we're part of, or even through partnerships with customers where we think there's opportunities to test different things and learn about everything that is going on so we can remain current, relevant, as well as think about what our future looks like as a kind of a private, publicly traded company. Obviously, that's important for us. But ultimately, the most important thing is how do we continue to deliver value to our customers? That's the thing that drives us. That's the thing that drives every single project that we do, whether it's a grid solution or whether it's a more customer-oriented program. Ultimately, whatever we do has to be driven for customers. So we have a bunch of projects that we can talk. I'm sure we'll get into the details. But just wanted to kind of frame you a little bit of kind of my role within National Grid and encourage all of you that as you're part of a utility, I mean, think about how your utility faces some of these challenges that we all have in front of us.
Thank you. So the first topic I want to bring up is really around the scope of DR. You know, so when I hear people talk about DR, they mostly talk about renewables. You know, wind, solar. You know, when I look at DR, I look also at demand response, electric vehicles, storage. So one question for you guys is what is your view of a DER, and do you see DER solely as a way for consumer to manage demand behind the meter, or also for the distribution utility to manage the distribution grid and the transmission grid?
Yeah, so I'll take a first stab at it. So I think that's an important point. When everyone talks about DERs, people tend to think about solar and storage. Those are primarily the ones that everyone talks about. But if you look at, for example, the building stock and kind of the type of assets we have specifically within New York, upstate New York, you don't have a lot of those systems. So you have some solar farms, you do have a couple of solar storage projects. The reality is you have a lot of diesel generators, some of them for backup generation, some of them just because they want to have some additional generation on site. You have a lot of CHP units. You have a lot of building management systems that are out there. You have a lot of demand response that it's available. So when we think about distributed resources, we actually take a holistic view of all of them. And really what we're trying to do is actually try to bring an additional value to the customer. So the way we do that is, how many of you have heard about the DSP concept of distributed system platform concept? Some of you, obviously if you're in this room, probably have an idea of it. One of the projects we're doing in Buffalo is it's really trying to think about how do we solve capacity issues in Buffalo, in other places, but also how do we deliver additional value to customers. And the way we're doing that is through a partnership with a customer. It's a Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus. They own a bunch of institutions. They have a bunch of different assets. And we're really working together with them to really think about what's that localized price value will be at the distribution level, and how would we pay them for the different assets they have when we actually have a constraint in our system. So we're looking at blue sky days issues. We're looking at emergency situations. We're also using during large outages, so we can actually have certain areas being powered by their assets. And the way we've pitched this program, well, it has a ton of value for us from a distribution perspective. From a customer perspective, it's allowing them to think about how do they maximize the value that they get from the assets they already have. And I'll give you one simple example. They have generation, they have backup generation in their facilities. It's diesel generators, they've been there for years. And they actually have to make an investment to make it more environmentally friendly. They need to convert them to gas. They're diesel right now, they want to convert them to gas. And the only way they can actually make the economics work is if they actually work as part of this DSP model. So it's allowed them to have an asset that they can use for whether it's backup or anything else, and they can actually make the investment work because now we're leveraging their assets during specific days of the year to help with grid issues. So for us, that's the way we're now thinking about planning and thinking about operating the grid. It's actually starting to bring a bunch of those customer assets that are pretty much idle right now for the most part. They're not being leveraged, and actually enabling them and activating them in a way that it's easier for customers, it's a simple program for them to participate, and it's a good way for us to optimize how we think about the grid. We're doing that in partnership with a company called Opus One, which, I mean, the word partnership is one that keeps coming up a lot in this kind of discussions. And this is a true partnership. I mean, they didn't have a product fully developed, and they're actually working with us and a customer to really develop that product. So when Richard talks about partnerships, when all the speakers before us have talked about partnerships, we really need to think about we're venturing into this new world where no one really has the answer. We don't have the answers as utilities. Probably no one in this room has the unique answer. And I think what I would challenge all of you is like think about how you think about working with utilities and pushing those business models within your own businesses to deliver more value for everyone. So,
let me give a few specifics about Austin. So Austin gets about 160 net new people a day move to Austin. We have on average about a 2.1 ratio person to home. We have a ratio of 1 car to 1 person is kind of the averages there. So what we've realized as a community is with all that comes new homes, new power, new energy, and a lot of mobility challenges. We are not going to generate our way out of that growth with traditional last century's model. We're also not going to pave our way out of that growth by doing more lanes and more concrete. So we have to come up with new, smart, innovative ideas. And so bringing it back to kind of DER, so we have about 450,000 residential customers. We have a pretty mature demand response program. 1 in 4 residential customers have some sort of smart air conditioning thermostat that we've deployed within that home. So that's over 100,000. Traditionally, the way it worked for over 12 years was a one-way control mechanism where we'd put in these smart thermostats and then we could press this button and it would curtail and cycle off and folks could override it. The value proposition for our the secret is, the value proposition, which we're looking on DR to get a lot more value is, here in Texas it's called 4CP. And basically that's 4 times 1 a month during the summer where ERCOT calculates basically what your transmission cost is going to be based on what your peak load is in those days. So this allowed us to, we got pretty good, we almost 100% hit it. We do it about 14 times a year, we press this switch, but the goal really is to hit all 4 of those CPs, which aren't advertised ahead of time, but we kind of know what the policy is and are pretty good about guessing it. So that's the payback for us, is reducing that 4 CP cost back to the utility. For electric vehicles, in 2013, we got an ARPA-E grant to basically look at electric vehicles, not as vehicle to grid as a two-way flow, but just as a demand response asset. So kind of like where we do AC load, kind of treat it with vehicles. And what we found out is really 2 things. One, we found out our customers are quite okay with us interrupting charging during hot afternoons on their cars, much more so than air conditioning. You know, that seems to make sense, but we validated that. Out of doing it for 5 months, we didn't get one opt-out from a customer on that. The second thing we discovered is we're a big fan of open standards, so we did it a few ways. We had one company go the API route, was just terrible and bickery and the different, we'd be in on the calls and it just wasn't fun. And then we had one, so I was kind of control group, and we had another group use open standards. Specifically at that time was Open ADR 1.0. It's now up to Open ADR 2.B. If I ever do a mass rollout with EVs and demand response, I will insist on any requirement of any company will have to be compliant with that standard because it's an awesome standard. And we as a utility, we don't want to get in the API business or pick winners or losers. We'd rather promote a bigger standard. And making your RFIs and RFPs standards compliant helps move the market as well. And then really, it would be such a wasted opportunity. Anyone who's looking at DERs and is not looking at EVs, at least of what the potential it could be, you're completely missing the boat, in my opinion. When you, for example, a home Tesla Powerwall is about 6.6 kilowatt hours of storage, and they say that's a residential system. A current generation of Leaf is 24. You know, Teslas get into 50s and 60s. So the numbers and the potential of opportunity is so much bigger than even what a stationary specific specific residential storage system looks like. So I'd at least incorporate it into your strategy. I would really embrace the Open ADR standard for that. And what we found is 80% of the value of managing EVs can be had by a demand response asset. It does, I mean, there's a lot of buzz in vehicle to grid and discharging. On my strategic roadmap, I have that as 2020 and beyond, because there's major barriers of doing it today. First and foremost, the car manufacturers say you'll void your warranty if you're discharged because you're putting artificial miles. There also isn't UL listed devices here that can do it. I mean, they have them in Japan. And then where the business case is. So with Shines, we want to discover that business case, and then everything will domino from that. But so that's kind of my thoughts on DR and EVs.
So I'm going to bring a different perspective as a grid operator and not a utility. And when we think about DER at the NYISO, really, we're trying to be as technology neutral as we can. But that doesn't mean that anybody can be a DER, at least in the guise of the roadmap that we laid out. Our focus is on dispatchability. We're looking for resources that can meet the criteria of the product they're providing. If they're providing 5-minute energy, then you need to be able to move in 5 minutes when instructed. If you're providing 10-minute ancillary services, you need to be able to provide those in 10 minutes upon notification. If you're providing regulation service, that's a second-to-second movement, so we need to be able to demonstrate you can do that. The technology behind what does that is less of a concern to us. Really what we're focused in on is the criteria and making sure that resource meets that criteria. A couple use cases that we laid out in the roadmap really focused around 5 different types. I won't go through all of them, but the various flavors, energy storage, we heard a lot about that. Demand response. Demand response is interesting because not everybody believes demand response can be a dispatchable resource on a 5-minute basis. I'd beg to differ, but certainly there are some limitations in that space. We've got microgrids, CHP. CHP's been around for a long time. As much as there are clean energy goals, CHP is still a reliable source. And then, believe it or not, we're starting to look and think about community DG. How do we incorporate community DG? In New York, there's this metering policy called remote net metering, where you've got customers that are signing contracts with a particular provider, and that's all on the retail side. How can that resource get some value out of the wholesale market? So when we think about DERs, and we think about the wholesale market, we think about the entire value stack. We hear time and time again about we need to maximize the value for these resources, and that's true, and that should be true of every resource, whether it's a DER or not. But in particular, DERs are interesting because you're looking at technologies where you need to synergize the customer's desires, the distribution system operator's desires, and then the wholesale market operator's desires. And if you can do all of that, you can really get some tremendous value out of the asset. So in that vein, New York ISO works very closely with all the utilities in New York to work through some of the coordination issues. It's one thing to say today we've got 1,200 megawatts of demand response We know when we call it. We give ample notice when we call it. Everybody's aware of we're going to call it. It's a 4 CP day. We don't have 4 CP days. We have 1 day a year that we measure
pressure's on.
capacity.
Better hit that
So you got to
one.
hit the 1 day. But when we start thinking about more animated load, resources that are really moving around and moving around based on the wholesale market desires, or moving around based on the utilities desires, or moving around based on your desires, now all of a sudden that becomes a coordination issue. We need to make sure that when we ask for the resource, we're going to get that response. When the utility needs the resource, they get the response. When you want to use it, it's still available to you. And so there's a lot of protocols that need to be worked through, and that's really our focus at the moment. Once we get through that, I think you're going to see New York start to lay out a real foundational element of how these values can be achieved. And so that's the most interesting part about what we're dealing with today. There's some use cases. The Buffalo Medical Campus is a very interesting use case. We have a use case in the Con Ed territory. Richard spoke about it quickly, the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program. There are a bunch of other use cases that I don't know that we speak about a lot. And those use cases have to do with a desire for a community to go green. And all of a sudden they're putting money up to go build a solar array. And we would much prefer a larger solar array than a bunch of rooftop. You know, as a grid operator, probably as a utility, but I won't speak on their behalf, we would like the larger scale stuff. It's easier to manage, it's cheaper, it's more efficient, and if you can do that and then incorporate some of the values out of the wholesale market, you start to really spread those costs around much more of the consumers. And so you heard a little bit this morning about, you know, how do you deal with those that want and can, and those that want and don't have. And we deal with that a lot in regulatory rate design, but really what we need to start thinking about is how can we provide those values so we don't have to force the design that way, but rather let it natively come out.
Thank you. The second topic I want to talk about is really the transition to DER. You know, so we heard from, you know, this morning and today from the panel that really deploying DER in a widespread, efficient, cost-effective, really required integration, specifically to the electricity grid, the existing electricity grid. You know, and integration I mean both on the business process side and the technology side. So if we think about it, basically trying to facilitate smoother transition for the industry and for the customers into this new electricity infrastructure, what are some of the things that you guys are doing in terms of pilot, in terms of you know, easing the transition?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll talk about a couple of projects that we have going on, which kind of speak about that transition. I mean, for us, we see DERs as something that it's valuable. In Massachusetts, we own about 35 megawatts of company-owned solar, and the current standards don't allow the utilities or pretty much anyone to really control the output from those panels. And we actually have been working with Zpryme and a couple of smart inverter companies to really think about how do we then control the outputs of those solar panels at specific times during the day. And we've placed those solar systems in areas where we have highly constrained feeders. So during specific times of the day, we can then basically control the amount of solar that gets into the system. What comes with that, it's obviously some of the economic challenges associated with reducing the production. And we're also thinking, we're thinking as part of that, how do we then compensate? In this case, they're company-owned solar panels, so it's easier for us to actually play with the outputs. But as we think about scaling the solution more broadly, we still have a question on, okay, well, if I'm a customer and then you're throttling me down during specific days, how would you compensate me for the lack of production that I'm not getting during those days? And that's still a big challenge for us. We've done some early analysis on what the costs and the tariffs would be. But it's at least from a technology perspective now, we're starting to play with those inverters and making the most out of it. The other piece that we're seeing is we understand that obviously the utility will not own all those distributed assets, and in most cases it will be actually the market or the customers. And one of the things we've done is in New York, we've come up with a new program around hosting capacity. So one of the biggest challenges of integrating in a safe and reliable manner distributed resources is, how do you do it in an effective manner? We hear from developers every single day saying, well, utilities are really slow in connecting DERs. Utilities don't want to have DERs. The reality is it's not that utilities don't want to have DERs. The utilities have to make sure that we're protecting the system and we're make sure that we can still deliver safe, reliable power to our customers. So what we've done is actually a hosting capacity analysis in all of our feeders in New York. With using analytics, we can actually predict how much load at any given time we can actually bring in terms of distributed resources. And that allows developers to say, well, if I want to place a new DER resource somewhere in the system, I know what the economics will be before I even start to do a pro forma on that job. So it's a way for us to really enable that market and get those developers excited to put systems in the place where it's actually more effective for the grid, but it's actually easier to integrate it into the grid. You don't want to put a system where if you put a 5 megawatt solar system in a place where you have to make the change in protections, that can get really expensive. So if you know that information up front, you may still put it in that place, but when you're doing your economics, you know you have to factor in something related to the protections. So those are two examples that we're looking to kind of bring, kind of transition to DERs. The other piece, and it's something that has come up in the panels today and even yesterday, it's around low-income customers. When we think about DERs, we don't really think about low-income customers. They don't necessarily have the means to get a solar system in their home. And we have a project in Buffalo where the utility actually saw an unmet need where customers really would like to be efficient, would like to actually get access to those technologies and actually get the financial benefits of having solar in their homes. They don't have the means to do so. So we worked with a PSC in New York and came up with a program where the utility actually owns the solar panels in their customer's roof. We actually give them a credit, which actually helps them to pay their bills, which has obviously a broader benefit for everyone else that, because it lowers the bad debt. But one of the biggest benefits that we're seeing with that program is not only we're helping those customers to get access to solar, we're actually using, because we own those panels in those customers' roofs, it's about 500 kilowatts. They're actually all concentrated in a feeder where we had some reliability issues. And because we have smart inverters in those solar systems, we can actually use all that solar production during the day to actually manage and optimize how that system, that feeder operates. So it's actually an opportunity for us as a utility to optimize how we think about the system. It's an opportunity for those customers that otherwise would never have access to have solar panels in their home. And then more broadly, actually as a system level, we're actually helping to lower the cost of bad debt that ultimately gets paid by all customers, because those customers that host a solar system in their home actually get a credit that actually helps them to pay their electric bills if they were not doing it before. So I think those are the type of things that as a company we're really thinking and pushing the envelope, or thinking creative of how do we use DER even to solve some of the more traditional problems we have in the distribution system.
Yeah, those are pretty interesting projects. So here in Austin Energy, you know, I'm going to talk about shines, and you talked about business and technology as far as the transition to DER. And a big part of that, the shines roadmap, is developing those business cases. So when we looked at value streams, we identified 24 value streams. A lot of those was from an EPRI model, but we had our own folks look at it, so we added a few and tweaked it. But we're focusing on 11. Well, a lot of people think on batteries, they think of one of those 11, and that's basically reduce my demand charge, because I'm a commercial and how to reduce that. But there's a lot of others. There's ancillary services in the ERCOT market. There's power quality. So there's a lot more, and some values are focused at the customer, like demand charge, but some might be focused really at the utility or at ERCOT. But we want to take a comprehensive approach, and our goal is we will be publishing on all these findings. You know, it's part of our grant requirement. And so my role is the principal investigator, so I'm kind of on the hook to make sure these reports get published and those kind of things. And so we hope that any utility or any other body could take a look and kind of take a buffet approach. Well, this works for us, and this aggregated model doesn't, or whatever. Another thing we look at, and so there was a comment, you know, from the grid operator. You know, we like big. I mean, that's how all operators are. We want to control it. We want big. Needs to be over 100 megawatts or over 50 megawatts, and then, you know, other than that, you're just, you know, you're dripping in our grid. But we see value in all those streams. So we are a big fan, and the lowest cost right now, like West Texas solar, the PPAs we have coming in are published amazingly low, and those are a fantastic part of our portfolio, and is going to be a key part of our roadmap to get to our 55% wind and solar by 2025. No way around it. But we see other tiers as well. So going down is we just rolled out something called community solar. And so that's where customers who maybe, like me, I live in a multifamily, and even though I'm HOA president, I can't put solar on there without doing, I wouldn't even imagine the bickering I'd get from my community on something like that, even a progressive town like Austin. So community solar allows people like me to buy into a local solar. So in this case, anyone been by Palmer and see that big rooftop solar there? So I own part of the generation as being a community solar member. So it's a little bit of a premium, might add about $15 a month or so to my bill, but I know I'm investing in solar, so even though I don't have the physical location to put in a solar panel, I can still feel pretty good. Also, my office looks right into that, so I get a check on it every day. If it looks dusty or whatever, I know who to call to make sure we get that generation going. And then we go down a tier on why commercial enterprises do it. So we have a lot of commercial, and it's generally around demand charge, or it's around resiliency or outage management. It's typically why we see the commercial do it. Now, residential customers, there's no such thing as a demand charge for residential customers. So why do we have over 3,000, residential solar, and why does Austin Energy give a pretty hefty rebate to it? The reason behind that is, so for our residential customers, we don't do what most utilities do and just turn back the meter when you produce. You produce and it goes negative. We have something called value of solar. So it means, they get an extra meter. But we give them a flat rate, and it's right around 11 cents, and it goes up. And why we do that is, we're a tiered utility. So like California utilities that have tiers, the more you use, the more expensive it gets, encourages energy efficiency and whatnot. And what we find, if you just turn back the meter, you're paying someone with a pool pump and a big house and maybe an efficient house a lot more because you're shaving off the top tier versus someone living in a very efficient or a bungalow, whatnot, because our tiers, they scale up very wide. So that just doesn't seem fair, frankly, and it's not what we're trying to encourage. We want the efficient house to also have the rooftop solar on it. So by having a value of solar is we give, whether regardless of what your home profile looks like, you're getting that same 10.5, 11 cents of everything you produce to encourage that. Now, if you look at our value of solar stack and methodology, it's just not about generation. We give you value towards climate protection goals. We give you value on transmission and distribution costs. We give you, so the utility recognizes there's more than just you being a generator. The value of that citizen who has rooftop solar in their house is different than a solar power plant in West Texas that has to go through the CREZ lines and it comes through there. So that's why we do it, and that's how we tie it. So we think there's value in all tiers. The purpose of Shines is to really do a deeper dive into that value. I don't know all the answers. We have a few theories. We're still trying to figure out the value on like residential storage. I don't even have a theory on residential storage with the existing costs on it, but we hope to discover that in Shines, but that's what we're working on.
Dripping from the grid?
Like you can't even bother. I say 5 megawatt and you roll your eyes. Like, why are you even telling me about that?
So on a more serious note, it's really hard to follow Karl. It really is. But when I think about how we're going to get to where we're going to get to, what comes to mind for me is perspective. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you about all these cool projects we're working on. I'm not going to sit here and tell you about all the great software design that we're going to deal with or the regulatory policy that we're going to have. But we got to remember the history. We all got here from a particular path. My path was a little different probably than Karl's path. And that perspective really drives who we are. And we got to think about when we engage with customers, they all have unique paths. Not every customer has the same desires as the next customer. And so one thing as an ISO, a grid operator, that is important is for us to start to engage with the customer. We've tended to stick with dealing with, in New York, they call load serving entities, large conglomerates that customers usually go to get their retail access from. and we forget what's happening down on the ground. And so when we in New York start to think about what are we doing and how do we get there, we think about circumstances where we learned a lot. A circumstance where we learned a lot was back in 1998 when there was an ice storm in Potsdam, New York, and it was decimated. There wasn't a pole up for hundreds of miles, and that community all shacked up in a university student union, and they had no water, no medical, none of that stuff. Then you fast forward a little bit. We have a blackout in 2003. I was on the control room floor for that. Very interesting experience. Go forward, now we got Sandy. And NYU becomes a safe haven for many New Yorkers. So we need to learn from those situations and really think about, when we do this, what is the value that we're providing? What are these customers really looking for? We run all of these markets, we run all these solicitations, we run all these contracts. Where does resiliency fall into that? Is that opaque? Is that out there? So there's that. But then the other piece of this is what can the ISO do about it? Well, we can provide perspective and information. I heard this morning about data a lot. I don't need data. I have so much data, I don't know what to do with all the data. I need information. I need to turn that data into something I can make a decision on. And so with that, the ISO is focused on providing more information to you folks. I talked briefly about granular pricing. Wouldn't it be great to know the wholesale market price for every street corner in New York City and be able to quickly know that on that street corner, this is the value? Not some engineering name of what the actual PSSE model had in it, and so that engineer named that bus W49, and who knows what W49 is. But really that's the cross section of West 49th and 15th Street. Wouldn't that be great? That's information. So we need to learn, and then we can't forget. So as we do that, we're really focused on education, and we're working with our local universities a lot in this area. One of the more recent research items I've been working with a local university on is how can we put some diagnostics or analytics on a distribution feeder and tell me all the DERs on that feeder. I don't need to know every meter on that feeder. I don't need to know what every customer on that feeder is doing. I don't want to know that, and I don't think the customers want me to know that. But how can I figure out what they're doing so I can better provide their service? It's math, but you can do it. And so we're looking at research like that. We're looking at research for trying to figure out how best to deal with all these disparate communication systems. You've got a distribution system operator, a transmission system operator, and an aggregator, and a customer, and how do you deal with all that communication? And we're looking at second-by-second communication. You can't have it go the full length and still get there. So those are the things that we're focused on so that we can provide a better value and better product in the long run. But it's all about perspective.
So I got the sign that we have 2 minutes. So 2 minutes? Questions? Couple questions. Yeah.
I've got one. Carlos, you touched on it with, you're talking about the university and Mike, as a system operator, talking about the customer. That's amazing. But community microgrids.
What a backhanded compliment. I loved it.
I'm shocked.
Dripping from the grid.
Microgrids, I mean, you can get those stacked values out of it. We talk about DER. We're not really talking about microgrids. So could you guys speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll talk about the Popham project. So Popham is the case that Mike was talking about, and it's an area that gets affected heavily by weather. And they don't have a lot of things outside of Potsdam. So if you go to that area, I mean, outside of Potsdam, there's woods and woods. That's pretty much what you get. And but they have a large population of students. They have probably about 12,000 students that they're pretty much locked into that area. So we've been working in a partnership with them to really define a community microgrid that will really help them to have some of the critical facilities up and running. But one of the biggest challenges hasn't been the technology of actually doing the microgrid. The microgrid was actually the easiest part of it. The challenging part is actually who pays for the microgrid and how the microgrid gets paid. And one of the things that we're working with the customer, which I think it's an important facet of this program, is we're actually trying to come up with a new tier recovery approach where the closer you are to the microgrid, obviously the more benefits you get from the microgrid, and the more you pay into that microgrid. So if you're one of the institutions that actually would benefit for being open during a large 2-week storm, you would obviously get enough business to actually recover perhaps that incremental cost. So the way the model is working out now is those customers will pay more. As you get farther from the center of the microgrid, you still pay because you obviously benefit from the microgrid. So we'll have a bank open, a gas station, a grocery store. So you still benefit from the fact that Potsdam still has power in those critical facilities, but then you pay a little bit less. And then the third ring is you still are within that same county area. You get some benefits, but you don't have to pay as much. And that's a model that we've actually seen. We're in the final stages of the program, where we think that new tariff, where based on where you are, you pay more or less. We think that that's a model that actually scales for all microgrids within our service area. I think we got the sign off. We're done.
Thank you very much.